They never expected it. Hamilton's insane comeback shocked Ferrari to the core. Don't miss the moment that turned the entire season upside down. Watch now. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. Lewis Hamilton emerged from the garage at Spa-Francorchamps with a calm intensity that bordered on surreal. There were no cheers echoing from the grandstands. No pre-race optimism pulsing through the paddock. No false bravado from the media. He wasn't entering the grid as a contender, nor even as a dark horse. The world had all but written him off. His qualifying performance had been catastrophic by every metric imaginable, a sequence of laps plagued by instability, understeer, poor traction, and inexplicable technical decisions that left him languishing at the very bottom of the timesheets. He wasn't starting from the midfield. He wasn't buried in the lower points. He was last. Absolutely dead last. This was Spa, a cathedral of motorsport where legends are born, and Lewis Hamilton was beginning his race from the shadows. Not because of grid penalties, not because of a rain-soaked gamble gone wrong, but because Ferrari had once again failed to provide him with a car capable of expressing his brilliance. A machine that had, session after session, actively worked against him. He had pleaded for specific balance changes, offered data-backed feedback, even made repeated requests for rear-end stability. But the engineers had chosen another route. They'd committed to a different philosophy. One that didn't include him. The setup was wrong from the outset. The tire preparation didn't work. The aero configuration was mismatched to his driving style. Rear grip disappeared after a few corners. There was no predictability on entry. The car twitched violently through medium-speed turns. Corner exits became survival exercises. And in debrief after debrief, Hamilton had been met with vague answers, forced optimism, and cold deflections. The relationship between driver and team, once full of promise and symbolism, had decayed into something transactional, distant, even adversarial. Most drivers would have crumbled under the weight of that failure. Most would have gone through the motions, driven cautiously, protected the car, and looked ahead to the next weekend. But Hamilton isn't most drivers. He didn't just accept the situation, he weaponized it. As the formation lap began, there was no radio drama, no motivational speech, no panic in his voice. Just pure, unfiltered concentration. Every movement inside the cockpit was precise. Every tire warming motion calculated. He wasn't preparing for damage limitation. He was preparing for war. The 5 red lights disappeared, and in an instant, Spa's sprawling tarmac became Hamilton's battlefield. The opening laps weren't a reckless charge, they were a masterclass in measured aggression. He didn't dive bomb in desperation. He studied each car ahead of him like a chess grandmaster analyzing a vulnerable board. He forced defensive errors. He induced lockups. He used DRS like a scalpel. When others brake at the 100-meter board, Hamilton braked at 90, but with such control that it felt effortless. Lap after lap, he dissected the midfield. One car at a time. Alpine, Haas, Williams, it didn't matter. They weren't obstacles. They were opportunities. His throttle application through Eau Rouge was inch-perfect. His lines through Les Combes were so refined, so confident, that even seasoned commentators struggled to believe what they were watching. Overtake after overtake, he didn't just pass, he dominated. Meanwhile, the Ferrari pit wall, frozen in disbelief, scrambled to adjust. They hadn't anticipated this. Nobody had. Their strategy models hadn't factored in a Hamilton resurgence. They were busy managing Leclerc's tire windows. But on the other side of the garage, Hamilton was crafting a masterpiece out of madness. On lap 19, he made a call to box early. The tires were holding, but he saw a gap, a strategic chasm he could exploit. The switch to the mediums wasn't unanimous in the garage. The strategists hesitated, but Hamilton insisted. His tone wasn't arrogant. It was surgical, clinical, convincing. And when he rejoined the circuit, the undercut began working immediately. By lap 25, he had cleared 4 more cars. By lap 30, he was harassing the rear diffuser of a McLaren that had qualified over a second ahead of him. And he didn't just pass it. He obliterated it. The onboard footage showed it all, a man possessed, in complete control of chaos, dragging a flawed car into places it didn't belong. Through Stavelot, he kept his foot planted where others lifted. Into blanchiment, he refused to flinch. He was playing with the very limits of tire life, mechanical grip, aero wash, and winning. The cockpit was silent. His pulse rate didn't spike. His movements were smooth. He was in a zone very few athletes in any sport have ever entered. A zone beyond logic, beyond physics, beyond expectation. By the final laps, he had reached 7th. Most drivers would have settled. But Hamilton never settles. He chased 6th like a lion hunting a wounded gazelle. Only a stubborn defensive drive from a rival with superior top speed stopped him from going further. And then it ended. 44 laps. Dozens of overtakes. One miracle. The checkered flag waved. He crossed the line not in victory, but in something even more powerful, vindication. The entire paddock watched, not in awe, but in silence. Because they understood. Every team boss. Every engineer. Every rival. They knew what they'd just seen. This wasn't a points finish. It wasn't a podium. It was a statement. A bulletproof, high-octane, emotionally devastating message to Ferrari, to every individual who had sidelined his feedback, questioned his setup instincts, doubted his hunger. He hadn't spoken a word, but he had screamed louder than anyone else on the grid. And the fans knew it. Over 80% voted him drive of the day. Social media ignited. Legends of the sport, past champions, retired icons, praised him without restraint. Analysts replayed the overtakes on loop. Journalists rewrote their post-race scripts. Even rival team members walked past the Ferrari garage and shook their heads, muttering, "He's still got it." Back inside, Hamilton removed his helmet slowly. Not with showmanship, but with quiet satisfaction. He knew what he'd done. He didn't need fireworks or confetti. The performance would live forever in footage. In numbers. In emotion. What had begun as a hopeless weekend, a disaster of preparation, a farce of strategy, a betrayal of potential, had become one of the most unforgettable performances of his career. Not because of where he finished, but because of how he refused to be forgotten. And now, the air has changed. Teams whisper. Red Bull listens. Mercedes watches. And Ferrari, they feel the tremor. Because Lewis Hamilton didn't just defy a bad car. He didn't just outdrive his teammate. He transcended machinery. He exposed truth. He shattered illusions. And everyone in Formula One understands what that means. The storm is coming. Take everything you thought you knew about Lewis Hamilton's Spa weekend and discard it. This wasn't about bad luck, poor timing, or being caught on the wrong side of a red flag. What happened to Hamilton in Belgium was the culmination of deeper systemic failure, the unraveling of a broken philosophy buried beneath datasheets, misjudged innovation, and a growing disregard for driver intuition. His Q1 exit wasn't an anomaly, it was a symptom. A glaring warning sign that the internal structure at Ferrari, particularly on Hamilton's side of the garage, was beginning to fracture. What the public didn't see, what cameras couldn't catch, was that Hamilton's car had been fitted with a controversial, unproven component just days before the race. It was a bold but reckless decision made by a faction of Ferrari's engineering division, an entirely reconfigured underfloor suspension interaction system designed to create more consistent ground effect behavior. The goal? Improve aerodynamic flow through long-duration corners, increase rotation on entry, and stabilize high-speed exits. The idea looked fantastic in the simulator. The numbers lit up beautifully on graphs. But there was one critical issue: it hadn't been tested under real racing conditions. Despite internal pushback from several experienced engineers, and behind-the-scenes resistance from Hamilton's camp, the leadership greenlit the installation of the prototype part onto Lewis's SF-25. This wasn't a data-gathering exercise in a Friday practice session. This was full deployment. In Spa, arguably the most brutal and revealing track on the calendar. Hamilton, who knows a car's behavior better than most know their own reflection, felt it within the first sector of his first timed lap. Something wasn't right. The car's response through corners like Malmedy and Rivage was disconnected. Entry rotation was erratic. The rear end refused to settle mid-corner. And worst of all, the car's grip was inconsistent, not just lap to lap, but corner to corner. One moment it gripped like a scalpel, the next it stepped out like it was skimming across ice. He raised the alarm immediately. Feedback after FP1 was extensive. Clear. alarmed, but professional. He explained in fine detail that the aerodynamic balance had shifted unpredictably, that the car was misbehaving under both low and medium downforce trim. That brake modulation was being compromised because the platform was unstable under deceleration. His instincts screamed that something in the car's foundation had gone wrong. But the reaction from the garage was cold, mechanical, and detached. Engineers combed through telemetry. Analysts cited model forecasts. Strategists reassured him that the system's potential was worth the learning curve. They told him to trust the data. They told him the issue was track evolution. They told him to give it time. What they really told him was, "We don't believe your feedback is more valuable than our computers." As the weekend progressed, the situation went from concerning to catastrophic. By FP3, Hamilton had stopped fighting the car and started surviving it. Any attempts to push past 95% resulted in micro-corrections, snap oversteer, brake lockups. Eau Rouge became a gamble. Turn 9 was a nightmare. The car bucked like it had no memory of the lap before. The experimental system, which was supposed to smooth the aero load transfer and create a predictable handling window, had instead destabilized the car entirely. It was no longer a race car. It was a prototype built on hope. And then came qualifying. In a session that should have been a formality for a driver of Hamilton's pedigree, Spa turned into a public humiliation. As rain threatened and track temperature dropped, Hamilton went out early, hoping to put in a banker lap. But the car refused to cooperate. Even on a light fuel load and fresh softs, the SF-25 wandered unpredictably across the circuit. The balance was nowhere. The grip was evaporating. Sector 2, traditionally one of Hamilton's strongest, became a war zone. He crossed the line, P17. Knocked out in Q1. The paddock exploded with disbelief. Journalists whispered in media centers. Social media detonated with speculation. Pundits pointed to tire strategy, track position, timing errors. But the truth was simpler and uglier. The car he was given couldn't perform. Full stop. Inside the garage, the silence was radioactive. Mechanics avoided eye contact. Engineers looked buried in their laptops. No one offered a straight answer. Because everyone knew the experiment had failed, and that Hamilton had predicted it 2 days earlier. In the technical debrief, Hamilton didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw blame. But every word he spoke hit like a thunderclap. This isn't about a bad lap. This is about a car that wasn't ready to be raced. The room froze. Not a whisper of disagreement. Not a challenge. Not even an apology. Just more metrics. More excuses. More references to simulation discrepancies and projected downforce targets. Behind the scenes, Hamilton's frustration boiled into something deeper: disillusionment. This wasn't just about Spa. This was about a philosophy that had gone completely off track. Ferrari had fallen in love with data to the point of forgetting what racing actually feels like. Driver instinct, that sixth sense forged through decades of wheel-to-wheel battle, had been reduced to a variable in a spreadsheet. Hamilton had joined Ferrari to restore its legacy, to elevate the most storied team in the sport back to its rightful place. He knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but he expected respect. He expected to be heard. And in Spa, he realized he wasn't. The car wasn't just flawed. The culture was. He left Belgium knowing something had to change, and fast. Because while the headlines focused on the shock exit, while fans debated tire temperatures and outlap traffic, Hamilton had seen the real problem up close. And it wasn't the weather. It was Ferrari. What came next wasn't merely a setback, it was the ultimate slap in the face. A soul-crushing, humiliating twist that transformed an already frustrating weekend into a personal crucible. Due to an emergency overhaul conducted in the dead of night, a rushed attempt by the Ferrari crew to reverse the self-inflicted damage of an experimental setup, Hamilton's car violated the strict parameters of parc ferme. The consequence? He wouldn't even line up on the grid. He would start the race from the shadows. From the pit lane. Not behind the pack, beneath it. Removed from the spotlight, stripped of momentum, denied the adrenaline-laced chaos of Turn 1. No slipstream, no wheel-to-wheel launch, no reference points. Just isolation. It wasn't just about starting last. It was about being excluded from the narrative before it even began. For most drivers, that kind of penalty is demoralizing. It signals a race that's already been lost. The media, the analysts, the so-called experts, they collectively shrugged. What could Hamilton possibly achieve starting so far from relevance, especially in a machine that had been described by his own engineer as dangerously unstable less than 24 hours earlier? But Hamilton isn't wired like the others. He doesn't operate within the constraints of conventional expectation. His defiance of odds isn't an act, it's his instinct. While the paddock slept, Ferrari's engineers were in full triage mode. The disastrous balance issues, the knife-edge rear instability, and the catastrophic behavior in high-speed corners had forced them into desperate recalibration. The ill-conceived aerodynamic tweak that had compromised rear grip was removed. Suspension travel was optimized. Camber settings adjusted. Damping ratios softened to give the rear axle more compliance. The ride height was raised microscopically to improve curb absorption. Brake migration was reprogrammed. Downforce distribution was rebalanced. Every parameter, every line of code, every bolt tightened with renewed urgency. They didn't build him a miracle, but they gave him something they hadn't all weekend, a car that didn't fight him back. And that was all he needed. As the red lights disappeared and the main field thundered into battle, Hamilton emerged alone from the pit lane, a solitary force re-entering a war he had no business winning, at least on paper. But he wasn't there to survive. He was there to rewrite the script. From the opening lap, it was obvious this wouldn't be a passive afternoon. The rhythm in his steering, the throttle application, the positioning into corners. Everything was intentional, measured, aggressive, but with total control. He wasn't just gaining places, he was deconstructing opponents. His overtake on Tsunoda into turn 9 was a masterpiece of bait and switch, showing a feint on the inside before snatching the outside under braking with millimetric precision. Moments later, he carved past Bottas through the high-speed SEs, modulating the throttle to maintain rear-end grip in an area where others lifted. The onboard footage revealed something extraordinary. His hands were calm. No corrections. No panic. Just a man locked into a zone so pure, so focused, that it felt otherworldly. And as the laps unfolded, so did the narrative. Hamilton wasn't climbing through the field, he was surgically dissecting it. Each car was an equation he solved in real time. His spatial awareness was untouchable. His tire preservation instincts were pristine. His energy deployment was clinical, harvesting in traffic, unleashing on straights. He passed Stroll with a late apex switchback that forced the Aston Martin into oversteer. He overtook Zhou with a DRS double bluff, catching the Alfa Romeo napping out of turn 7. Every lap, a new chapter. Every sector, a new victim. By the midpoint of the race, the mood had shifted. The paddock was no longer watching the frontrunners. They were fixated on the man from the pit lane who was setting purple sectors in clean air, closing in on the top 10 like a heat-seeking missile. Commentators stopped talking about tire strategies. Team principals were checking data. Race engineers up and down the grid were recalculating gaps. Because Hamilton was coming, and no one knew how to stop it. But this wasn't just speed. It was psychology. He was inside their heads. Rivals began braking earlier, covering lines they didn't need to, looking in their mirrors more than their apexes. The name Hamilton on their timing screens had a gravitational pull, one that made even the most seasoned drivers falter. Even his radio messages told the story. Calm, sharp, focused, no wasted words. When the strategist suggested switching to Plan C, Hamilton responded with surgical clarity, offering fuel delta readings and live feedback on rear tire behavior. He wasn't reacting to the race. He was commanding it, from a position no one thought possible. When he finally reached the DRS train formed by Norris and Albon, he dismantled it with brutal efficiency. A double pass down the straight into turn 1, braking impossibly late, trusting the grip in a way that felt almost defiant. He didn't celebrate. He didn't roar. He just drove. Because this was never about recovery. This was about resurgence. Every lap he completed was a slap in the face to those who'd labeled him past his prime. Every position gained was a reminder that greatness doesn't fade, it just waits for the right moment. They had boxed him out, pushed him to the sidelines, forced him to start from nowhere in a car barely held together by overnight panic. And yet there he was, storming back into relevance. Creating spectacle. Dominating headlines. Owning the story. By the time he reached the edge of the top 5, there was no more doubt. Not among fans. Not among critics. Not even among those in his own team who had quietly begun focusing on Leclerc. Hamilton had reclaimed his status the hard way, through fire, through grit, through brilliance. And as he crossed the line, having pulled off one of the most devastating pit lane to points drives in recent memory, he said nothing. Because he didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. Loud. Clear. Unforgettable. There was something utterly uncanny unfolding. Something that felt almost dreamlike, as though reality had been paused mid-race. A phenomenon far beyond understeer, tire degradation, or weather variables. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't visible on the timing tower. It was atmospheric. And it began with a silence, not in the grandstands or on the track, but in the one place it never should have existed, Ferrari's radio channel. The same Ferrari that was infamous for over-communicating, for smothering their drivers with non-stop feedback, for overloading the airwaves with a barrage of delta times, split-second suggestions, tire condition updates, and endless Plan B and Plan C changes. That very same Ferrari had gone quiet. Dead quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't just say we're observing, but whispers we're stunned. No urgent corrections. No mid-corner guidance. No reminders to push or conserve. Just open space on the airwaves, a reverent stillness. They weren't operating the race from the pit wall anymore. They weren't managing Lewis Hamilton's decisions. They had simply stepped back, almost in disbelief, and allowed him to take full command. Because what was unfolding before them was something too pure, too instinctual, too masterful to interfere with. This wasn't Ferrari conducting Hamilton's race. This was Hamilton driving the soul of Ferrari, and perhaps for the first time, doing it better than Ferrari themselves ever could. By the 20th lap, the transformation was complete. He wasn't just in the points, he was writing a new narrative. The rest of the field was dissolving in his mirrors. Chaos surrounded him, but none of it touched him. Carlos Sainz cracked under pressure, hit with a time penalty after a desperate defensive move that looked more like survival than racing. Lance Stroll, caught in a haze of hesitation, fumbled critical lines and paid the price in positions. Yuki Tsunoda's emotions got the better of him as he miscalculated a move, resulting in unnecessary contact. But Hamilton? He was in another realm entirely. Every lap was sculpted with precision. Every overtake was a signature, personalized, clean, undeniable. He wasn't forcing his way through the field, he was inviting it to step aside. Through wet patches, high degradation zones, and unpredictable dirty air, he never missed a beat. His lines were mathematical. His throttle control was musical. The car beneath him, once a source of frustration and doubt, now looked reborn. And yet, it hadn't improved overnight. He had adapted. He had done the recalibration. Not the engineers. Not the strategists. Just the man behind the wheel. And when the race concluded, when the checkered flag waved and he crossed the line in 7th position, having overtaken nearly half the grid in a car that had humiliated him the previous day, the moment that followed was somehow louder than any podium anthem. Because it came with no fanfare. No fireworks. No screaming voices over team radio. Just a calm, unemotional message delivering sector comparisons. No joy. No celebration. Just muted facts, delivered with surgical detachment. But within that muted frequency, something powerful vibrated, acknowledgement. Ferrari didn't cheer because they knew they hadn't earned it. They hadn't engineered this comeback. They hadn't orchestrated the recovery. They had watched it happen, helpless, voiceless, almost reverent, like spectators in their own garage. Lewis Hamilton had taken the ruins of a broken qualifying session and turned them into a masterpiece. Not by yelling. Not by throwing blame. But through action. Through pace. Through authority on the tarmac. And most astonishing of all, through dignity. When the interviews came, he delivered them with grace. He smiled when asked about the race. He thanked the mechanics, complimented the pit crew, and commended the overnight changes. His tone was respectful, controlled. But the real message wasn't in the words. It was in what he didn't say. He didn't need to explain who carried who. He didn't need to lay out the imbalance between effort and support. Everyone watching already knew. From the fans to the broadcasters to the engineers at rival teams, they had seen something undeniable. Lewis Hamilton had performed an act of resurrection. Not of his career, but of Ferrari's credibility. In one afternoon, without a podium, without a fastest lap, without a champagne spray, he had reminded the world why he's regarded not only as a great driver, but as a force of nature. His drive had spoken with more clarity than any press release or data chart. He didn't demand respect. He commanded it, simply by showing what he could do when left alone, when not shackled by mismanagement or burdened with compromise. And in that silence on the radio, that strange telling silence, the truth echoed louder than any team principal ever could. They weren't managing a driver. They were witnessing a legend. Let me know if you'd like a continuation of this story, perhaps how the paddock reacts in the days that follow, or internal conversations inside Ferrari. This was never a publicity stunt. This wasn't a veteran desperate for validation. This wasn't about appeasing fans or reclaiming lost admiration. This was something far deeper, a statement carved into every corner, every maneuver, every tire rotation. It was Lewis Hamilton unleashing his full capacity, not to entertain, not to impress, but to prove a point where it hurt the most, inside the very team that had consistently underestimated him. This was about setting the record straight, not through interviews, but through undeniable performance. This was about confronting Ferrari with the consequences of their own negligence. For far too long, Hamilton's expertise had been drowned in analytics. His feedback, tempered by decades of experience, had been filtered, ignored, or sidelined in favor of simulations and overcomplicated metrics. Spa wasn't just a response, it was an exposé. A race that peeled back the layers of mismanagement and exposed a truth so glaring that even Ferrari's most stoic engineers could no longer pretend it wasn't there. The whispers inside the Maranello headquarters have now grown into full-throated doubt. Technical teams that once stood by data-driven arrogance are now revisiting race footage, looking for what they had missed, what they had dismissed. A shift in tone is spreading, not loudly, but definitively. It's in the longer debriefs, the quieter meetings, the sudden surge in respect for Hamilton's post-session input. There's a collective realization setting in. They've had a thoroughbred stallion shackled behind politics, behind favoritism, behind organizational blindness, and they let him simmer in silence. Now the silence is broken. And with it, comes a flood of uncomfortable questions. How did they allow this level of performance to stay dormant for so long? How many strategic errors were made because the team's culture favored hierarchy over listening? Why did it take a single weekend, a single race, to make them see what was already in front of them? Because Hamilton didn't just win the fans back at Spa, he jolted the soul of an entire team. His performance wasn't clean or comfortable. It was aggressive, ruthless, tactical. A blend of intellect and instinct so sharp it left rivals in disbelief. Every move on track was methodical. Every decision was premeditated. Every sector time screamed a single unwavering message: you should have trusted me. Outside the garage, the motorsport world exploded. Social media ignited like dry grass under a flame. Footage of his overtakes, defensive positioning, and sheer racecraft surged across platforms. Former skeptics admitted fault. Broadcasters ran back-to-back highlight reels. Drivers took notice. Analysts began dissecting his radio calls with a new level of seriousness. The paddock, once quietly writing off his chapter in red as a misstep, suddenly started rewriting the narrative. He wasn't fading, he was reawakening. And it wasn't just the fans who took notice. The tension shifted inside rival camps. Engineers in rival teams recalculated. Strategists reevaluated their threat analysis. Because this wasn't just a driver in good form, this was a warning shot to the grid. A declaration that the legend wasn't done, he'd simply been ignored. Hamilton, who had arrived at Ferrari with the hope of writing an elegant final act, now seemed hellbent on turning it into a reckoning. One that would unfold race by race, not with fanfare, but with focus. Not with speeches, but with lap times. And Spa? Spa wasn't redemption. It was retaliation. Retaliation for the radio calls dismissed mid-race. For the pit stops that came too early or too late. For being treated like a ceremonial figurehead instead of the gladiator he still is. For being placed in a team that said it wanted his experience, but didn't act like it. That pretended to value his input, but never built around it. The consequence is now real. Spa changed the game. Not just for Ferrari. Not just for Hamilton. But for the entire 2025 title landscape. In a single afternoon, the equilibrium shifted. A spark was lit, not a flash in the pan, but the start of a slow-burning fire that could consume the rest of the season. And now, there's no turning back. Because Hamilton isn't just driving for podiums anymore. He's chasing a bigger prize. Not just trophies or titles, but control, influence, redemption. The chance to remind the entire F1 ecosystem that he remains, without a shred of doubt, one of the most lethal, calculated, mentally unshakable forces the sport has ever seen. And if Spa was only the beginning, then what's coming next will be even more relentless. Because when you take a man who still has the fire, and finally give him a car that listens, you don't just unleash a competitor. You awaken a storm.